Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian at the Reagan Library in Simi Valley, California, where we're covering the 2016 Reagan National Defense Forum. Our coverage is sponsored by Raytheon, and I'm honored to have with us Dr. Dov Zakheim, former Pentagon Comptroller, Senior Advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and most importantly, the proud father of Roger Zakheim, who is one of the brains behind this operation. Dov, thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me, and that's absolutely right, because for quite some time, Roger was my son. Now I'm his dad. Things change.
Exactly, and he's doing a great job, and this has really become an incredible event in the last 4 years. What I want to ask you first is, you served in the Reagan administration, which for you is an important thing to be here at this event, and you've served in the Bush administration, but you also have been an impartial observer or been an objective and bipartisan observer oftentimes of national security events. Talk to us a little bit about what the Trump team is doing right and what the Trump team isn't doing right now as it gets mobilized to enter office on January the 20th.
Well, what they're doing right, I think, to begin with, frankly, is Jim Mattis. To appoint someone who is universally liked and respected. I got an email from a senior ambassador from one of the Gulf states who said, in effect, they were praying that Mattis got the job. Given some of the things that were said in the campaign about Muslims, they were terrified. And Mattis, I think, just gives them a feeling of comfort that they didn't have before. So that was a terrific decision. Holding off on Secretary of State as long as they have probably is not good, because it just gets people worried. And not only that, it gets the opposition in this country to sort of run around the world and say, well, look how terrible things are. That's not good for the United States. We only have one president at a time. Whether you voted for him, whether you didn't vote for him, it's irrelevant now. If he fails, we all fail. And that's something that people have to keep in mind. Now, by not yet coming out with a Secretary of State, he's reinforcing these kinds of negative images that people are painting, not just of him, but of America. What does Putin think? What do the North Koreans think? What do the Chinese think? The longer this goes on, the more they figure, well, the United States is pretty much washed up. In fact, I had dinner with a senior official from Russia who essentially said it doesn't matter who wins because inertia will prevent you from doing anything. That's exactly the impression we don't want to give people.
You've also, though, served in diplomatic capacities, for example, in Iraq, when you were involved in very sensitive negotiations. Yeah. There have been a couple of news stories about how the president-elect has been, in the words of, I can't remember if it was the Times or a Post story, somewhat breezy in some of these conversations. And you've talked about how important language is and focus is. Do you think that that's a potential challenge that could create problems for the future?
Well, it creates problems for the diplomats. I'm not sure it creates problems for the United States. As we've seen with the current president, personal relationships really do matter. They matter when you're dealing with the Hill. They matter when you're dealing with leaders abroad. These guys, all these leaders, they've made it to the top of their domestic respective heaps. They think that they are on a different level from everybody else. And you know what? They are. And they interact. And so if you get a relationship going, people are criticizing Trump like crazy because he spoke to the Pakistanis. We're still funding the Pakistani military. By the way, I started that program way back when. We need the Pakistanis to be more helpful. Do you honestly think that by stiffing them, they'll be more helpful? We've stiffed them for 7 or 8 years now. How helpful have they been? You always win with honey. And if this is Mr. Trump's way of doing business, that's not necessarily bad. So I'm not going to jump to criticize just yet. Now, he probably ought to reach out to the Indians at the same time. That's the way it works. But to stiff people, if he wants to stiff somebody, I can think of some other countries to stiff.
Let's go to the financial. Well, let me ask you civilian control over the military question. It's been some of my Republican friends who've always made the point it's so important to maintain civilian control over the military. And there are some that have expressed concern to me. Look, you could look at this administration, it's perfectly fine. Colin Powell, Brent Scowcroft, served as National Security, Al Haig, have served in the position of National Security Advisor. Al Haig and Colin Powell went on to become Secretary of State. But in this particular case, they're saying, look, you'll have Flynn in as National Security Advisor. You could have Jim Mattis over at the Pentagon. You could have David Petraeus over at the State Department. And then you could also have John Kelly over at Department of Homeland Security. And then there are a couple of other names who are mentioned as possible senior jobs. Does that present any form of a challenge from your standpoint?
Well, if they all get the jobs, yes. If it's just General Flynn and General Mattis, I'm not sure. For a start, Flynn and Mattis are such different people, different experiences, different backgrounds, different temperaments. General Mattis is the kind of guy who is so straight that if he doesn't agree, he'll tell you to your face, and he's not going to back down. He has done a lot of diplomatic work. Like I said, he has tremendous fan club in the Middle East. And by the way, not just with the Arabs, with the Israelis. So that really tells you something right there. If both guys like him.
Yeah, but that was also because he was very tough on Iran and wanted to be very, very tough on Iran.
So he lost his job because he was tough on Iran. So I'm not concerned about civilian control per se, unless they're all appointed to these jobs. If you get 4 generals in the most important national security jobs, then you do have a serious issue. But to have somebody like Mattis at Defense, who understands the problems, and who, by the way, understands he's a civilian now. He has always acted that way. He's never acted, and there are some generals and admirals, they retire and they forget that they're no longer active generals and admirals. He's not like that.
He returned to Walla Walla in his books, and he would make that very, very clear. Let me ask you about the priorities. What do you think this team's got to do when it's looking particularly from a Pentagon standpoint? What are your top 3 or 4 priorities that they should have when they enter office on January 20?
The first thing they've got to do is recognize that unless the budget seriously increases, there's no way they can fund the bomber program, B-21, and the submarine program, the Trident follow-on, without gutting the entire Navy and Air Force. They've got to find that money, which means that priority number 1 has to be get rid of the sequester. Now, since Mr. Trump also wants to spend money on infrastructure, there's a deal here that did not exist under Mr. Obama. Clearly, there will have to be more money on the domestic side. He doesn't seem to be as uptight about budget deficits. He hasn't said very much about it. He thinks there can be savings in the Pentagon, and there will be some. It's not going to offset the bomber and Trident follow-on program. No way. But the sequester has to be lifted. I think he can do that. If that becomes his top priority, then I think you can see realistic increases in procurement and in acquisition, both procurement and R&D, that we need just to stay where we are. You got to remember that right now the Pentagon is somewhere north of $120 billion in the hole, and that's just to stay still. That's a huge problem.
What do you think the financial picture, though, is going to look like? Walk us out the next couple of years. How do you first, okay, we're saying sequester is going to go away. That obviously, you don't have any arbitrary budget caps anymore, so you can spend as much money on that. But again, you mentioned infrastructure. There's a tax cut that's in the offing. There are a whole series of events that are much more Democratic initiatives than they are historically Republican initiatives. So as you look at that, what's the realistic amount of money? Is the department going to get, he's used the Heritage Foundation's plan as a baseline, which is up to $100 billion more a year. Are they going to get to that point where it could be that much more money?
Well, I think it's a nice starting point. I don't think they'll get that much. $100 billion a year increases a lot. But they certainly need somewhere north of 25 or 30 a year at a minimum. And then you've got the OCO. And a lot of the OCO, the Overseas Contingencies Operations account, is actually meant to be in the defense base. So you have to add that as well. Now you're getting close to 50 billion, 60 billion a year. So this is not trivial money, even for the Defense Department.
Last question on manpower. One of the key features of the Heritage Plan is a manpower increase, and there are some folks who are disputing that. Where do you fall on that? Do you think we need more people or not?
Absolutely need more people. This era we are now in is the first time since the Sino-Soviet split that we have to face them both separately, and separately or together, because they work together as well. So in addition to having an Iran, in addition to having a North Korea, which are kind of major threats but not dramatically existential threats, we now face a China that could become an existential threat, and a Russia that has the nuclear capability to be an existential threat. We need more. You cannot be in 2 places at once, no matter how good you are, no matter how good your technology is. That is something that I think people are going to have to face up to. There's a thing called Lanchester's Law. And basically, the law is, in effect, quantity is a quality all its own. Well, it may have changed a little bit since he was looking at aircraft, most of which had propellers at the time he wrote this law. But there's a fundamental truth. If you want to be in the Mediterranean again, because the Russians are, and you want to be in the North Atlantic again because the Russians are back, and you want to be in Southeast Asia, and you want to be in the Middle East because you can't leave it, you don't have this. You just don't have the resources and the forces for it.
Do you? The last question then would be: there are those who look at some of the comments that Mr. Trump made during the campaign, whether it was questioning NATO or, for example, looking at the fight against ISIS as a higher priority, something that's worth making a deal with the Russians over. Folks in Europe that I've talked to are particularly concerned that there'll be an easing off on Ukraine. There'll be, some concessions that might be made to Putin to get him aboard on that, even though Putin has shown no inclination to want to fight ISIS in particular. And there are those who also look at it in Asia. I was talking to some Japanese friends. We were over in Halifax together, and there was concern there where the Trump administration may want to make an accommodation on security in order to get some of the economic terms that he's so clearly said to support American workers, jobs, et cetera, which are all very noble goals. But ultimately, do you share that concern that there could be condominiums made on both of these sides, which actually takes some of these security challenges off the table technically?
Well, first let me say that it was at Halifax that I heard a lot of the people, our Americans, scaring the Europeans and the Asians even more than they should have. So we need to reassure them, not scare them, number one. Number two...
Although Senator McCain, though, and Shaheen and a number of others did try to reassure everybody.
Absolutely right. Absolutely. And it was good that both the Democratic senator and Republican senator did that. Regarding this deal, so-called, first of all, we have to recognize, whether we like it or not, that the Russian bases in Syria are the equivalent now of Guantanamo. They're there in perpetuity. That is a much higher priority for them than it is for us. Now, I understand there's a humanitarian disaster going on, but I recall back in the early 2000s, as soon as there was some degree of stability in Afghanistan, 2 million people came back from Pakistan. People will come home if they know their houses aren't being bombed. So that's number one. Number two, with respect to Ukraine, it's not just Trump who has thought about how to deal with it in a different way. Zbigniew Brzezinski mentioned the word Finlandized. I believe Henry Kissinger said the same. Why must we have a Ukraine that tries to get into NATO and at the same time has to fight a war with Russia because it's trying to get into NATO? There are other ways to deal with this one. What we have to want out of the Russians is, first of all, don't mess with any NATO ally. You may not like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania being part of NATO, but they are. So, butt out, as you might say. Secondly, we have to tell them, if you want to have a condominium with Assad in Syria, keep the Iranians out. Don't let Syria be a corridor. In effect, telling the Russians you better double-cross Iran. No, the Russians, they're pretty good at double-crossing people, particularly if they have a KGB background, so I'm not too worried about that. But if Iran is stopped from being able to supply Hezbollah through Syria, Russia can have Syria, Israel feels more confident, the Gulf states feel more confident, and frankly, if you're sitting in Moscow, what's more important to you? Syria plus Israel plus Egypt plus the Gulf states or Iran?
Okay, you raised Hezbollah, you mentioned Israel. Let's talk about the two-state solution. Where does that now stand? Obviously, as the Knesset has passed legislation that would seem to clear the way for more housing developments. That's always been a sticking point. How do you see that breaking out? And is this issue now a completely done deal? And everybody's going to have to just stick to a one-state solution ultimately.
It's definitely not a done deal. Full disclosure, A, I support a two-state solution, have for many years. B, I actually wrote an article that said that we should take what's called offshore procurement, where we give the Israelis money and they just do with it what they want, buy what they want in the military sphere, but since money is fungible, in effect, we are subsidizing these settlements. I said we should give them the choice, either subsidize your defense industry or subsidize your settlements, but you can't do both. So that's where I am on this.
And like full disclosure, you've had a food taster and a car starter ever since you canceled the Levy program, but that's another...
That's true as well. That's for another time. I think there's a fundamental Israeli interest in a two-state solution. If you go to Israel, you see how many people are terrified that they'll send their children to school and they don't know if the kid's going to get run over by a car or get stabbed. What just happened in Ohio State happens in Israel almost every single day. Is that what they really want? So yeah, you got a bunch of settlers who live on little mountains and think that they're, Brigham Young or something. But guess what? you've got 6-7 million people in that country who want a quiet life. And the only way they're going to get it is if the Palestinians have a state of their own. So at the end of the day, maybe it won't happen with this particular Palestinian leader, and maybe it won't happen with this particular Israeli leader, but it's going to happen.
And do you think the Trump administration will play a role in that?
I think Mr. Trump likes to see himself, he said it, as a negotiator. It gave the Israelis a big scare, because on the one hand he says he supports them 100%, and he's moving the embassy to Jerusalem, just like every one of his predecessors has. On the other hand, he wants to make deals. He sees himself as a deal maker. The question is, can he make a deal with the current players on both sides? I think the answer is probably not. But there may be an election in Israel in a year from now. Abu Mazen's getting older. This president's going to be here 4 years. Wait and see.
Dov, thanks very, very much. We really appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to our debate on Saturday.
Absolutely. Looking forward. And you'll be a great moderator, sir.